Right.
Okay, well, I'd better introduce you first, haven't I, really? I'm sure most of you know Murray. On my email, I put Murray Rowlands, local councillor for a long, long time, and also a military historian. Am I correct in saying that? Well, that proves it here anyway, but well-known character in the town, and very welcome. Thank you for coming here. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much. And the other bit is, this is going back to my New Zealand heritage, obviously to talk about the man who really won the Battle of Britain. And even now, you might say Sir Heath Park, and you still get a sort of non-recognition. You'd say Dowding, Lord Dowding, few people. But these were the two men that really were responsible that we're probably not sitting with swastikas in this room at the moment for the victory in the Battle of Britain. It's a hypothesis if the Nazis had actually won the Battle of Britain, what would have happened to the country. They were, obviously, you've seen the pictures of marshalling on the other side of the Channel, and this was a preparation for it. And the one thing that was deterring them was, of course, the Royal Air Force. So if they'd knocked the Air Force out, and we'll talk about, as usual in Britain, a group that were for personal pride trying to undermine what Park and Dowding were doing, it would have been a likely occasion. So that's a justification of being here and writing my book on Sir Heath Park. And we'll sort of go back to I'm not sure how.
Arrow on the side, just above your mouth, the arrow on the side there. Up. Stop.
That one?
Yeah.
That one?
Yep.
Okay, antecedents. I think he arrived in New Zealand, in Auckland, just outside of Auckland, when he was 2 years old. So he can't claim complete English antecedents. No, in fact, his background was Scots. And he came with his father and his family. His father was a mining engineer, and at that stage there was gold near Auckland, and his father came out to the Auckland goldfields. The father subsequently moved on to Dunedin, where in Otago there was a major find of gold, and that's where my lot turned up. And that was the big attraction of fourth generation New Zealanders, largely coming from the goldfields in Otago, and settling the Edinburgh of the South, which is called Dunedin. So I'm one of the Gaelic speakers here. So this is the sort of first accommodation, the type of place where the original people lived. Am I on the arrow? Okay, so Heath was not a brilliant scholar. He just got by. He much preferred to be on the docks, looking at boats and ships. And when the family moved to Dunedin, when he was in his teens, he joined the army, or the sort of cadets. And when war started in 1914, he was about 16 or 17, and he immediately enrolled for the New Zealand Army. So who can tell me where the New Zealand Army went first? What was the big Australia, New Zealand, the first occasion in the First World War? Gallipoli. Okay. And here is the slide I've taken on Gallipoli. The Anzacs landing, which was an absolute debacle. The more you read about it, the more you think of how bad it was managed. Everything was wrong. It ruined Churchill, for all normal people, would have been ruined as a person because he was one of the architects of it. So it was a disaster. I'm not sure why Park did it, but Park was with the New Zealand force, and then he swapped over to the English or the British Army. It's not clear in my reading of the background, but he fetched up in the British Army and was one of the last to leave Gallipoli when, of course, there was the evacuation to Gallipoli. He was, I think, probably had a legacy of very poor health for the rest of his life as a result of it. Most of those who survived actually were left with malaria and various types of illnesses. So Park inherited that as well when he left. But he was well enough to be on the Western Front in 1916. And he, of all things, he joined the cavalry, and here's he dressed in one of his cavalry uniforms. But somehow he got the idea about the things to come were going to be aviation. At that time, you can imagine 1912, 1913, what the aeroplanes looked like. But he'd seen examples of it. And although at his age, he was in his 20s now, he was really too old to be recruited for the embryonic RAF. He managed to pull influence within the high command and actually got in to be trained as a pilot. And that's where his experience with aviation started. And here's an example of the training that was going on in the West Country, the training school, where the primitive ideas of developing fighter aircraft were being developed by this particular training school. Bearing in mind at this time your life expectancy was pretty dodgy, about probably 20% flying those things. If you didn't crash, there were German aces, and the Germans at this time were some way advanced in the British and the type of aircraft they were producing. So your life expectancy wasn't particularly high. So there's a high turnover on embryonic pilots being recruited for what was going to become the Royal Air Force. At that time it was the Air Flying Corps, with very low status. Hagen, obviously, and some of the military history, somebody who's looked at military history, know Haig's view of them was not particularly favourable. But despite him, there was a growing realisation that the aircraft were going to be an important part of war in the future. So he managed to get in, managed to be involved, and there's the young Park going to France, and he got increasingly frustrated because he got stuck at an airfield in northern France, and although the battles were going on 40, 50 miles away from where he was, there was no move to actually employ the planes that were sitting around him. But eventually he actually did get involved, and this is the type of plane he'd be flying. Very primitive, and of course, if you followed the history of wartime aviation, one advance would be then taken over by the Germans, who have another particular development, which put them well ahead, and then the British would come up with their advance. So these things were changing continually, and as they did right throughout the period, right up until the Second World War. It was a continual invention of new types of aeroplanes, and looking at that, you wouldn't think that the Spitfire and the Hurricane were somewhere in the background. That looks pretty antiquated to our eyes. So this is the type of plane that you'd be expected to navigate and be able to fly. And here's a picture of Park in among, I think he's in the middle there, with his fellow pilots at one of the stations. Park immediately was a major success. He brought a great deal of practical ability in navigating his aircraft. He had a record number of kills, as they called it, sorry to be brutal, fairly early, and he rose through the ranks, so he was a squadron leader by 1917, and one of a group of new aircraft leaders that were developing alongside what was going to become the Royal Aircraft, the RAF. So he was rising through ranks and developing new ideas about aircraft fighting, how to effectively do it, squadron work. He was thinking through these developments. And obviously this was just outside of Calais. This was a type of camp where they'd go to and they'd be based. And as I said, Park initially got very, very frustrated, having trained and sitting there for 2 or 3 months waiting till he was assigned to one particular squadron to actually fight. And here's another picture, and it's a while since I looked at it. Where is he? I think he's number 5 on the back row there. But these are the young men, all with standard moustaches. If it's, I don't know, tattoos now for a younger generation. At that time it was moustaches. And there are a few without moustaches, not many. That was the standard. And of course, that as life expectancy was short, these men were obviously, when they weren't flying, and of course you've seen all the cliches of daring young men, etc. That was the ambience on which they operated. And once they got into actual combat, as I said, your life expectancy was in the 20-30%, as it was always right through the period we're going to talk about. Obviously you were intent to live life to the fullest while you had the chance. This is one of the inventors who at this time were working on new developments for aircraft. Watson Watt. It's a bit ahead of his time. I don't know if it's out of sync, but there was the rapid rate of development in aircraft. We'll be talking about even further. And this is a shot of Park just as the war was finishing. And here he is with a group of his fellow pilots. And these again, looking at the camps where they operated from. A picture of Park in the 20s when he met up. He met up with Dowding. So after the war finished, there was a period when the whole of the British economy, the whole of the British establishment was based on winning the war. Park, as I said, had risen through the ranks, was one of the senior Royal Aircraft Establishment figures. And of course, then was a real question of demobilisation. A little like the situation now, where the government seems to be looking for things they can get rid of, can cut. And if you imagine this on a massive scale, scaling down the whole military operation. So Park, for a period, if you like, was out of work. Where was he going to do? What was going to be his development? So at one stage, in the 20s, he was a military advisor. He went to Argentina and to Latin America and was advising them on the setting up of an air force. So this was a private sort of operation as a aircraft advisor. However, he'd made contact with Dowding, and one of the things they did was, you all know about Alcock and Brown flying the Atlantic. Park was one of the first group of men who flew around Great Britain. That wasn't as dramatic as flying the Atlantic, but at least they did things like that, or the first flight across from London on a regular basis to Dublin, and they were pioneering using aircraft gradually for transporting people in a normal sort of commercial operation. So they were pioneering that, which was to go on into the 20s. Okay, I don't know, we seem to have got the wrong slide there, unfortunately. Obviously, when it became, the other thing that was going on was, of course, that there were aircraft fairs taking place, and this was superficially something that many of you would go to, I think only comparatively recently did these die out. That you'd go to an airport and the latest aircraft would be shown. There would be, of course, stunts and flights and things like that. There are a few still that happen, but it doesn't seem the same sort of importance as is now. And they'd try out new aircraft at that time. So at that time, the question was justifying the expenditure that the government might put into designing new aircraft. So just after the war, the great pattern was to cut everything. It soon became apparent with the rise of Hitler from the 1930-29 onwards that aircraft would be important, and of course always important to keep pace with the Germans. That seems a funny thing to say now. Well, if you imagine the perspective is to keep pace with the Russians. They were aware of the developments taking place in Germany, the same situation that was operated in the war. The British would come up with a new designed aircraft. The Germans would respond with Messerschmitt or something like that, and the British would have to respond in some way. So at this time it became obvious that the type of plane you saw an example of earlier was not going to be compatible with competing with the Germans. So there was a competition in aircraft building. So in 1933, the development of the Spitfire, and of course before that there'd been the development of the Hurricane. And Park was involved with Dowding in test flying these aircraft, being aware what they were like, forming up flights that would actually utilise them in the time of war. It became available in that way. And of course the question of setting all this up, as it became obvious that the threat was coming from Germany by the mid-30s, the question was setting up airfields. And there hardly is an area in our part of the south of England. We were designated as aircraft area 11, and that was to be the focal area. So this is an example of the airfields that Park and Dowding and the Air Command had to set up in order, if they thought there needed to be some sort of air defence available. And of course, as well as that, they became aware of something else which was developing, and I showed the photograph of him earlier, Watson Watt. And what do you associate Watson Watt with? Radar. Okay. And of course, not very far from here, we went and had a look at the centre that was set up. Uxbridge, yeah. And this is where this had to be created. And you notice the predominance of women in that photograph. That, as I think there's one man there, two men, one man. This became something that when war actually broke out, you were looking for your resources of women who come in and actually work in radar and be part of the plotters that you've probably seen in slides of what was happening. And again, these are where the centres were dotted, and the creation of the airfields around the south of England. Now, the reason why, of course, the area 11 was so important was, if you imagine that the Germans had had invaded France and had a limit. The aircraft that existed at that time only had a limited capacity as far as their fuel was concerned, the Messerschmitts that were available. So they had 30 minutes flying time, basically. And when you think of 30 minutes, is how far the aircraft would go, as far as England was concerned, in 30 minutes. And of course, these were the particular areas which were immediately under threat, and where most of the Battle of Britain actually took place. So obviously, that's the concentration of where these airfields were. And of course, as part of that, Park had to rely on Dowding's influence with Churchill and with the Conservative government. Conservative government originally started being very suspect of the RAF, but by the time 37, 38, there was a realisation how important that the air battle was going to be. And as I said, if the Germans had actually, if Lee Mallory, we'll talk about him shortly, or someone like that had been in charge, and we'd lost the Battle of Britain, now those troops which were assembling on the other side of the Channel would have then had an easy passage. Now you say the other alternative was the Navy to come round from Scapa Flow, but again that's hypothetical, and it would have been far more messier and far more difficult for that to happen. And of course, I mentioned the fact, a part of the whole process in 37, 38, when Dowding was looking at the concept of what air battles were really like, was to talk about observers and spotting where the likely attacks were going to happen. And of course, they were aided by, obviously, something I've just mentioned, by radar. And the Germans never, it was a very strange sort of circumstance, which Park talks about, that when radar was invented, and when these big masks were up, the Germans never realised how significant radar actually was. It was very strange, and they bombed some of the stations, but not all of them. They didn't realise how crucial this information was. But of course, as well as that, and some of you probably had parents who were involved as observers, there was a whole system of observers which topped up the radar system that was invented. Again, there's a map of, and of course as part of that was the physical building of airfields. As I said, many of them now extinct and in unlikely places, probably built over for housing developments and things like that. They're created in this Area 11, Squadron Area 11, where they thought the main attack would come from. This is an indication of once the Battle of Britain started. Now, how would you respond to massive aircraft attacks coming in to the south of England? You realise that, of course, the Messerschmitt's capacity was for roughly 30 minutes flight time. And in essence, that meant 15 minutes to get over England and 15 minutes to get back. So they had limited capacity. And how would you actually respond to that? Now, as always, this is office politics at a most aggravated thing. Park was a New Zealander. He was regarded as something of an upstart. He was brought on by Dowding, recognising a very great ability. But one of the other persons who considered he should be doing what Park was doing was someone called Lee Mallory. Is there a...
No, I'll get one for you.
Yeah, thank you. And Lee Mallory came up through the orthodox British establishment. Anybody remember? Anybody know what someone with the name of Mallory? Why? And the Mallory is important name in British history. The man was killed on Everest. That was his brother. Anyway, Mallory was very upset that he'd been passed over to take over this area, Area 11, where the focal point was being. Now, Mallory's view on how to tackle a German attack was to put everything up at the same time in response and take on the Germans in that way. However, Park's view was that he would the way that fighter battles operated, he'd put up small groups of fighters, particularly to aim at part of the invasion, and in that way he retained I think when the battle started there were around about 650 planes available to him, 650 pilots. The attrition rate was quite large, but that was his concept. He realised it was a battle of attrition, that if he put everything up at the same time, the attrition would be that much higher, and the Germans at that time had more resources to be able to win. So there was a friction between the two. And I'm sure some of you know Douglas Bader. Bader was a disciple of Lee Mallory, and Bader was not in Group 11, he was in 12, and he was one of the ones, thanks very much, who was sniping at both, particularly at Park, and sniping at him. Thank you. We'll come into the sad story of what ultimately happened. So the Germans were attacking with these large flights, and Park was operating on the basis of the skills of his pilots to take on the Messerschmitts as they were coming over, and he was getting a small attrition rate. So my reading of it, if you had a flight of 20 Messerschmitts, Park would shoot down 10 of them, but lose 6 of his own. So as the battle went on in August in 1940, gradually the attrition rate began to play out, but not good enough to ultimately win it. So they were fighting in a situation they were losing a considerable number of men and pilots, that the Germans had more resources to put in to win the battle. So as the battle went on, they were losing the Battle of Britain. Does anyone know what actual decision by the Germans changed that situation? What decision by Goering changed that situation? So if you take the date of August the 12th, what was the decision that probably saved Britain's bacon?
Bombing London?
Yeah, good. Well known. The decision to bomb London. So Goering, I don't know whether Hitler always got the wrong steer on most things, didn't he? When you read about the history of the war, Hitler got impatient, I suppose, that the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, had held on for these months and wanted action. So he probably said to Goering, "Go on, make an impression. The Brits don't seem to be keeling over. The key thing will be to bomb London." And you should probably seen newsreels of the period where, for the first time out of the blue, they began to bomb London. And that was a stage when it looked as though they they had a chance of defending the country. So the Germans switched to attacking London. That enabled Park to regroup, to retrain, to train more pilots. More planes were coming available to him, and so to develop, or had a chance to win the battle in general. So that was the key thing. The Germans' decision. If the Germans had kept on doing what they'd been doing, attacking the south coast, attacking as it's in my book, buy a copy if you want the more details, attacking places like Southampton, Portsmouth, read the history of those places, of what they were suffering during that period. That decision to move away from doing that to making what they thought would be a crucial decision to tackle London, in many ways that cost them possible victory. They were within days of running out of enough aircraft, enough pilots, before that decision was made. So it was, Goering and Hitler between them, that mistake that probably cost them ultimate victory. And that's a map of August the 13th. These crucial days in August, where the battle really was decided, and Park was just holding his own. Nice story about Park at this time. When the British were retreating from Dunkirk in 1940, Park didn't care about what the situation was, how outnumbered the RAF was. Park was in a hurricane flying over the beaches, trying to help and direct where the troops should be picked up. He was that sort of character. So Park was very much a hands-on leader in that sense. So again, but Park had realised that they were running out of the resources, both of men and machines, about the middle to late on in August. And fortunately, Hitler and Goering's decision that saved their bacon. And of course, Park was dealing with this man. Anybody know?
I can't think.
Sorry?
He looks familiar, but I can't.
Right, Beaverbrook, who was the reason why there were so many planes at this time was down to Beaverbrook. And Beaverbrook was not only influential in getting aircraft, he was also influential in defining policy as far as the government were concerned, had Churchill's ready ear. So Beaverbrook played quite an important part. And I said Park was hands-on. Nice story. Out flying to one of his airports, and having breakfast. I think he'd had an early flight, and he watched a young pilot coming in, who'd just been not properly trained, came in badly, clipped the trees in the rather improvised air landing spot, damaged the aircraft, and just managed to get it to land it. Park went out and ready to upbraid the pilot, and did so, but took the young lad into the mess, bought him a breakfast, and had a relationship with him which is well written about. He was that sort of man. He could he had a very distinct human side to him. This gives grim figures about the aircraft production. You can see they've managed, through Beaverbrook, had managed to increase aircraft production during August. But of course there was a continual loss involved. And they had to keep pace with that. But of course, one of the biggest losses was of course in men. Again, a plug for New Zealand. Who were these pilots flying? First, everyone know? Greatest number of pilots? Polish pilots. who'd come over, who got out of Poland when the Nazis arrived and were flying. Second, British pilots. Third, New Zealand pilots, 124 of them. Bearing in mind the population of New Zealand at that time was barely 1 million. So, and I wrote a short story about this. A lot of young New Zealanders more or less worked their way over so they could join the Royal Air Force and actually flew in the Battle of Britain. And here are two of the Nazi or German aces who Hitler systematically sacked. And there's the man himself. And there's Park sitting, as he loved to be seen, at one of his pilots. And there he always hands-on, meeting his pilots, talking about their experiences, finding out what had actually happened. On the other side of the channel, there's Goering talking to his pilots prior to one of their attacks. That's self-explanatory. I mentioned Bader. When the Germans attacked London, Bader and Lee Mallory were quite successful in defending London, but obviously the cost was far higher in terms of planes. But the Germans discovered that by then they didn't have the resources to take on the other flights. What was happening was that Lee Mallory, because of his own personal arrogance or ambitions, was not cooperating within Flight 11. And so when Park got into difficulty in far as numbers, or wanted some of his planes to counteract a German attack, he would usually send them too early or too late because he wanted to keep control. However, once, and we'll get on to talk about that, once a decision was made to sack Mallory, to sack Park and to sack Dowding. Now what happened was that all of this time, Lee Mallory, with his influences within the British establishment, right up to Churchill, was complaining about the way the battle was being fought, despite the fact that the defence, it was obvious the Germans were not winning, and after London could not win, they were conspiring against him. So about the end of August, it was brought to a head, and the British establishment sacked both Dowding and Park. Dowding was sent to Canada as an ambassador. Park was sent to an obscure airfield, and more or less forgotten about. So Lee Mallory took Park's place, and so they were out of it. So this was what was decided to do with them. And Bader, of course, was a young pilot who was within Lee Mallory's group. But Lee Mallory will appear again in Park's history. There's one of the observers. There were, I mentioned earlier, there were observers on the ground watching what was happening. This is one of the officers that later replaced Dowding. And this is the political conspiring going on within the Conservative establishment at that time that sacked Park and Dowding. And there's Park actually so what happened was that it became obvious that certainly a man of Park's ability should continue to play an important part in what was happening. And so a problem was arising, and this is when the Germans had given up, Here's Park with some of his pilots. When the Germans had given up and moved to attacking, as you know, attacking Russia. When they'd actually done that, the next crisis which arose was the Battle of Malta. Now, what was happening in Malta was that the tactic which was being applied was to meet the attacking Italian and German aircraft out at not attack them till they're over Malta. Park took over and bought new aircraft and was sent to Malta. And his tactic was to wait till the Germans were actually over Malta and then to put his aircraft up. And he was successful. So here's a man who was the architect, really one of the architects of victory in the Battle of Britain, sent to Malta. Malta was on the eve of almost being bombed flat, literally by Italian and German aircraft, preparatory to a possible landing. The Malta, he was again successful and had a major victory there.
Is that Churchill?
Sorry?
Is that Churchill or that?
I'm not sure. Again, the shite. That's it, Henry Air Session. And that was talking about I gave you the numbers of pilots. You see the New Zealand list there at number 3.
The Czechs way up there.
And these were the pilots. And when this is the letter. Park never complained about the way he was treated, and this is a letter where he sets out, and it's in my book. He sets out really what really happened and what he felt about being passed over at the moment when it looked as though he'd almost succeeded in defending the country. Park with some of his pilots. And this is now we're on Malta. He had to set up almost, if you imagine, I've talked about pilots all the time. Of course, there was aircraft and backup. I mean, in Malta, he had to create a system to support aircraft activity. So no effective system existed at that time. And there he is. He liked to put on a show. He had a very special red MG. I can't show that it's red on this, but he used to drive around the island. How many are familiar with Malta at all? He used to drive around the island to the airports, supporting the pilots. And it's worth going to the museum in Malta if you're in Malta, and seeing and following the course of the battle from their description. And there he is. The chap he's with was a New Zealand ace pilot who was in charge of one of the major flights there. And there he is, always flying himself, flying from one centre to another. As I said, he created what you had to do when you set up any sort of aircraft establishment. You had to produce the airfield, produce the backup. So you more or less had to establish airfields on Malta, capable of providing some sort of defence. And there they are there. Park was now in hotter climates, so you see his uniform was substantially different. Successfully defended Malta, played a major part in a lot of the defence of and fighting in the Middle East after it was clear that Malta had been successfully defended, and then was sent to the Far East, because you know when it was Battle of Britain, when Germany surrendered, there was still a war going on, and we've just been marking Burma and the Burmese campaign. Park was in Burma and was managing aircraft activity, was in charge of aircraft in Burma. And if you look at the history of that, a crucial aspect in winning it was that the only way you could support troops on the ground in Burma was flying supplies to the airfields they managed, or the clearings they managed to support them. So that was mainly, again, Park's experience in setting up an infrastructure, an airfield infrastructure that would support such an activity. And here you see in sort of lighter gear, talking to some of the people involved in that. Again, Park in the Far East. And here we are at the time when the Japanese had surrendered. Park was on the right hand. You can see him on the right hand side. You can't see Mountbatten here, but at many of the official ceremonies to mark the surrender of the Japanese, Park was the officer that would be standing, and you can see him standing behind the official here. Park was playing a leading part in that. The reason the reason why he was involved in Malta and subsequent in the Far East was that the British establishment had appointed Lee Mallory to take over responsibility as for the RAF in the Far East. On his flight out to take over that post, Lee Mallory crashed in the Alps and was killed. And of course, who did the British establishment go to immediately after that but Keith Park? So there you've got a situation where he went through the war and probably had 3 different campaigns or 3 different activities in 3 different major sectors. And at the end of the war, he was in the Far East, as I said, standing alongside Mountbatten as the Japanese were surrendering. He then, a tiger for punishment really, in 1945-46, he was placed with major responsibility in India for the repatriation of all the British troops, thousands of them, who were still based in India. And one of the difficulties they had was that getting all those men back, physically getting them back to England, because the Germans had sunk so many boats and ships that there was a problem about being enough ships to actually bring them back. So poor old Park got landed with trying to keep the troops happy, waiting till the appropriate boat arrived to take them back. And if you're reading your military history, there were quite a number of serious mutinies in India at that time. So he got landed with that. And finally, about the late 40s, I think, or early 50s, Park arrived, having retired and been retired off, arrived back in Auckland. And the last thing I note about Park is that he became Lord Mayor of Auckland for a period, became active in conservative politics in New Zealand. But I don't think he was ever a distinctive figure like some well-known New Zealand politicians. So that really is a background of a man that so many people don't know about, but is quite unique when you're talking about the Second World War and Second World War history. Almost has a catalogue of the major events in his experience. Thank you very much.
Yes, he's obviously a very versatile man.
Sorry?
A very versatile man.
An absolute versatile man, yeah.
Anyway, has anyone got any questions?
Very informative, thank you.
Oh, extremely informative.
What honours did he receive?
Interesting.
Sorry?
What honours did he receive?
Sir Keith Park, I think he got a great stream of acolytes. I think it was, what's the one above Sir? Is it Lord?
Look,
But military honours, you know.
Yeah, well, if you look at photographs of him, sort of stretched.
Were they the campaigns or?
Air Marshal.
Well, I mean, he got a lot in the First World War. He was heavily decorated as a fighter pilot in the First World War. So, I mean, he could appeal to his recruits because he was coming from a background where he obviously was a highly competent pilot in his own right. So he could relate to them. Sorry?
A bar.
A bar to his
To one of those.
oh, earldom, was it?
I know you got a bar, an extra bonus to
The original
Air
medal.
Marshal.
Yeah.
A high distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's obviously a very compassionate man, and you said you've sort of described that very well, really, I think. You know,
Yeah, and it's very difficult because, you know, there's a story about somebody travelling all the way from New Zealand and getting trained as a pilot and being shot down on the second day that he was flying. And he knew these men, so he had to, you know, cope with that
yeah.
on a human dimension.
Was he married?
Yes, I've got a whole lot of pictures. One of the pictures, and it's in the book, of his wife, and his wife played quite an important part in his life because obviously he lived most of his life in army camps. And there's a sad story. His son, one of his sons, of course, followed him into the army and was with the Army of Occupation in Germany. And he been on the booze with a friend, was coming back afterwards, and they had a military vehicle, and they fired off a round, and it killed a German cyclist, and he was court-martialed for that, and thrown out of the army.
Down for the old man, wasn't it, really?
Yeah. Well, possibly. I mean, it might have been more serious for him if it hadn't been
Yeah, I guess so.
son.
Oh,
Whatever.
was it?
But
Yeah.
and then the other son, one other son, was killed fighting in the Malayan emergency. So two of his sons. One son obviously survived, but the other son was killed in Malaysia. And when was Malaysia? Mid-50s, 60s.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Right, well, yes, that has been quite a very sort of heart-searching talk about the personality of a person, really. And so it must be interesting reading your book to see
Yep.
all the
That's there if
details.
you want to buy
I
it.
can't go home without buying one.
That's right. And you can't go home without being told about the next speaker, because he seems to have emerged out of nowhere to talk about researching military ancestry.
Yeah. I had a phone call from Gillian, lady
Yeah.
down, the curator here, yesterday, day before. I don't know if you've seen the exhibition downstairs. It's been down there for quite a while. There's one big cabinet and other bits and pieces from the Queen Alexandra Royal Army Nursing Corps. And the curator of their museum actually gave a talk, which my wife and I came to, but he's offered to give us a talk based upon that, the nursing corps on the spur of the moment. So I was down for next week, and I've now put myself at the back of the queue a long way, and we're going to have this really interesting talk from Keir, Lieutenant Colonel retired.
Yes,
Keir
Kieran Spires.
Uh-huh.
So, well, this notice will be in various places around the building. Yes,
Thank you all.
it's amazing how different, fascinating stories we seem to
Oh, we've got another one.
manage to acquire.
Booking up another one now, recommended by a lady, one of our regular audience last week, talking about Sir John Betterman. That's going to be in November, I think, sometime. But anyway, so we're getting gradually filled up. So
Almost up to Christmas.
almost up to Christmas, yes. So, thanks to people like Murray, we
Yes.
keep going. So if there are any more in the pipeline, Murray, we're quite happy to have you along.
Well, there's Sir Howard Gillies.
Well, there we are.
Oh, medical.
Yeah, plastic surgery.
Oh, that would be interesting.
Wendy shuddered at that.
But that
Which
was
I haven't.
local.
I was doing a book for Pen and Sword, and then there hadn't been a book written about him, and then somebody with a great line of medical expertise, I was told, was doing a book about him. So I struck that I wasn't going to go into competition with that. I mean, I would be talking about, you know, in general terms, Gilly's life,
Fair enough.
but he's certainly worth talking about.
Oh, right. Well,
Another New Zealander.
Because he was practising in Aldershot in the
Yes.
hospital
oh, was
on
he?
the ridge.
Oh,
yeah.
right. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it? Local again as well. So.
Yeah, another local person
Yeah.
at that time.
Right. Well, thank you all. For
Anyway, thank you very much,
Okay.
Mary. That was really
coming. See you all next week.
yeah. See you next week.
See you Sunday, I guess. See you Sunday.